Hello. Hello, hello.
Well, I will open our lecture before you start. The Honorable the Dean of Faculty of Law, Patimura University, Professor Adonia Laturete, SHMH, the Honorable the Vice Dean of Students Affairs, Dr. Stanley Pelo, SHMH, the Honorable the Head of Study Program, Dr. Irma Hanafi, SHMH, and our distinguished students. Mandy, before you start your lectures, just the little information for you that not only 100 students located at our auditorium and Zoom meeting, but also the Dean of Faculty of Law is joined with us. Thank you, Professor Adonia Latrete, to join with us. And to start the lecture, I would like to invite you. Mandy, time is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. I just want to check that my audio is working well with everybody. Can everybody hear me? Good to see you all. Apologies for being a little late today. Are we all good with the sound? Could people use their reactions and maybe put their thumbs up on their Zoom? Okay, well, I'll assume you can all hear me. I'm just going to hope to share my screen. Can you give me, it looks like I have sharing rights here. So we'll just one moment, apologies.
You can see the icon share on below your laptop.
Yeah, just not quite at the beginning of my presentation. So I'll just go back one slide. Okay, so everyone see the title slide? So I welcome you to put questions in the chat while we're talking. Feel free to pause me if you want to have further clarification, but lovely to be joining you, even if it is remotely. I'm very much looking forward to seeing some of the faculty, professors and staff in Southern Cross University in less than 1 month's time. So that will be very exciting. So I was asked to give this lecture on marine management on small islands. And of course, I'm speaking to a faculty of law, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a marine scientist. So I always come with a perspective of a marine scientist. But I have done a lot of work on small islands, not only in Indonesia, but also in Papua New Guinea. And of course, in Australia, we have many small islands off our coasts. Some of them are habited and some of them are also inhabited. But when we're looking at small island management, I really wanted today to put a focus on people living in small islands and the importance of those communities in small islands. So I'll just move on here. So when we think about small island management, when we think about small island management, we have a rather small land mass to the oceans around us. So our terrestrial resources are limited. So that means our dependence on the ocean for food resources becomes much higher. There's also a lot of reliance on externalities, which may be basic food supplies like rice, but also fuel and energy to power our lighting and our housing. And I know in Ambon, you have a diesel fuel supply, which is quite different from perhaps Ternate, as an example, which has a coal-generated power supply. That all influences the capacity of industry as well. Also, on very small islands, education opportunities are limited. And in this broader context, I want to talk to the complexities associated with sustainabilities. Might be tourism, exotic species invasion, waste management, not only solids, but also sewage. There's also issues of immigration as well. So, of course, I'm speaking from the connectivity between nature and people's use of nature. So you may, and you probably have heard of the term ecosystem services. This is something that we use to look at how the ecosystems that we live in and around actually support our living and functioning on Earth. So this is quite a complicated slide, but what I'm trying to sort of express here is that we draw upon the ocean for many different resources, whether it be the deep sea benthic ocean, the pelagic ocean, or the coastal environment. But all these habitats and communities are supporting our lives and livelihoods. We also have extractive resources from the ocean around us, which bring income to communities, but also cause degradation. And it may be fisheries decline, it may be pollution from activities such as deep sea mining, or mine tailings disposal, or mining activities. So those waste generating activities, as well as ecosystem depleting activities, really influence the integrity and the health of the ecosystems that communities rely upon. So this diagram is trying to highlight that there's feedback loops, and the size of those arrows will sort of depend on how well those activities that humans do are managed to ensure long-term, what we call intergenerational equity and economies and lives and livelihoods, which are very important when you've got high populations living in small land areas. But for me, I've always been very, I love Indonesia because it is so different to Australia. And of course, we have our tropical regions of Australia. I live in a subtropical region, but what Indonesia, what these tropical environments bring, which are different from much of the world, particularly sort of much of the Northern Hemisphere populations, is we've got very unique ecosystems. These are taxonomically unique. There's a lot of endemism, which means that these species are only found in particular areas, and island ecosystems are a classic example for that, because the ecosystems, the terrestrial ecosystems that live on those islands are actually isolated from other ecosystems. So over biological time, they've potentially developed unique species, and Galapagos Islands are the perfect example for that. But of course, there's many examples in Indonesia as well. So these places have different geochemistries, and those geochemistries are often related to the volcanic activity, which has helped form those small islands, and that geologic activity actually creates mineral-rich environments. And of course, Indonesia is incredibly mineral-rich in many places. So there's potential and existing mining operations. Of course, also there's monsoonal conditions. So you have a distinct wet and dry season, not so much winter and summer seasons. Very high humidity, and there's different sensitivities and receptors in terms of human impacts on the ecosystems. So if we look at the terrestrial environment, it is incredibly biodiverse, and it's a hotspot of biodiversity. The Indonesia as a country is within two bioregions, the Sunderland and the Wallacea, which has many island complexes and is, of course, very geologically complex. So there's sort of a little bit of an example of how unique Indonesia is in terms of this terrestrial biodiversity. 259 endemic mammals, 382 endemic birds, and 172 endemic amphibians. So quite a unique environment. And of course, the marine environment is no different. And when we look at coral species biodiversity, the darker that red color, the more species there are present in those areas. When you look at West Papua and the Raja Ampat area, there's between 550 to 600 coral species that exist in that area alone. When you compare that to the Great Barrier Reef, which runs down the east coast of Australia, we sit at about 350 species. So indeed, marked difference, and Indonesia in that sense is the custodian of biodiversity for coral reefs. Additional to that, the Coral Triangle has 45% of the world's fish species as well. So that Coral Triangle area exists inclusive of Indonesia. You can see that sort of funny awkward shaped triangle, which is outlined in red on that graph there. But what is important, I guess, for people studying law is this Coral Triangle Declaration was an international agreement which acknowledges the importance of this biodiversity, but it recognizes the important need to address poverty and so on. So back in 2009, the prime ministers and presidents of these countries, the Solomon Islands, the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste, the President of the Republic of Indonesia, Republic of Philippines, Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, and the Prime Minister of Malaysia all signed this binding agreement. It's a little bit hard to read that, so I'll just zoom in. And you can see that there's highlighting the concern over increasing level of degradation in marine and coastal and small island ecosystems within the Coral Triangle region. And it's reaffirming our common understanding to establish a cooperative arrangement to sustainably manage the marine, coastal, and small island ecosystems in the Coral Triangle region, and to ensure that these efforts contribute effectively to strengthening food security, increasing resiliency, and adaptation to climate change. So that's a really important agreement and declaration that is a fantastic reference point for small island communities and the importance of those small island ecosystems. However, the people of small island communities are actually often remote from federal government. They're not well educated, and there's also challenges to become or to gain education. They may be from different clans and tribes. They may speak several different languages and have slightly different cultures or extremely different cultures. And those coastal communities have potential impact sites to those communities, may be far away from the site where the communities are benefiting financially. And an example of that is mine tailings disposal and the impacts of mine tailings from the actual mine site themselves. I really want to highlight this picture here because it's a very good metaphor for the concept of fishing down the food chain. So the more you deplete your fisheries resources, the more you rely on protein resources that are imported and brought in from other areas. So this is a picture from a snorkeling trip I did, which is a can of corned beef in the ocean, pretty much where the fish should be and where our protein resources should be coming if we have a big ocean environment. So there's a waste disposal from canned meat, processed canned meat product in ecosystem that should be providing the protein resources itself. So it's a very interesting analogy. And of course, the communities in Indonesia that live on small islands not only depend on the water and the ocean resources for food, but often also on fresh water and for water to drink. This picture is actually Wayapu River on Buru Island near Namlia, and these communities are drawing the water from the river to consume. So when we think about seafood on small islands, it's really very important source of protein. It's rich in essential minerals, vitamins, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as omega-3. So in the region of Indonesia, we've done some surveys and we've found that seafood is commonly consumed at every meal. And you can just think about yourself and how much fish and seafood that you consume every week, and you would probably think most meals would have some sort of seafood. Very different to an Australian concept. Most Australians would eat fish perhaps 1 or 2, maybe 3 meals a week. So our dependence is very much more based on terrestrial protein resources. People eat a lot more beef and chicken, pork as well, and other protein resources, which may be based from the dairy industry as well. So the dependence is also very important for some of those issues which has been addressed by your national government at the moment, and malnutrition and stunting. People need to be have accessibility to protein resources. And they also need to be confident in that those resources are not contaminated and are healthy. And a few years ago, we did a study and we were looking at mercury contamination in seafood from Namlia markets and Ambon markets. And we also compared these to some seafood markets in Australia. And by and large, the seafood was within the guideline values for mercury. And importantly, we need to remember that mercury is a biomagnifying, methylmercury is a biomagnifying compound. Humans are sort of top predators and top consumers of high food chain organisms or high trophic level organisms. So we have the potential to consume excessive amounts of these biomagnifying compounds. And certainly in Australia, we have restrictions on the number of fish portions people should eat of these higher trophic level species, such as shark and tuna. And you can see here there was a couple of species, the barred queenfish, the grunters, did at some times exceed the mercury thresholds for food consumption. But it was that needs to be managed with in the idea of the whole diet. And just because you're eating seafood doesn't mean you're always at risk of consuming high concentrations of mercury. In fact, the lower order species, your herbivorous species, I have nothing to be concerned about. Neither at this stage does any of the mollusks that we sampled as well. In fact, your tuna was had lower mercury concentrations than the tuna in Australia, because I believe the tuna in Australia are quite a bit larger and older, and they've had more time for biomagnification. So this is in some ways a good news story, because it gives people security about the quality of the seafood resources they're consuming at local markets in the context of mercury. And probably just a few little warning signs to be looking out for. So there is a publication, and Justin Smalley and Albert Nanaloy from University of Padimura were also important contributors to this paper, and you can find a lot more information about that little bit of data that I showed up there. So importantly, when we are thinking about the mercury, particularly in this instance in Buru Island, you would all know that there's small-scale gold mining occurring there, and as part of the processing of the ore, mercury is used to extract the gold from the ore. So these activities are not legal, but they're actually very common, and it's an enormous movement for people to get engaged in this small-scale mining industry, to move from poorer situations to community wealth. So it brings a lot of wealth. There's a lot of initiative and activity associated with the gold mining activities, but there's risk of also impacts to ecosystems in the long term. And once that mercury is in the environment, you can't take it away. So there's a long-term legacy that you may need to consider, or you should be considering, when it comes to these smaller islands. Buru Island was also a net contributor to the national granary. It's relatively large island, I think, when we're looking at Indonesia, but there's a lot of contaminated sites there from the old trommel sites now. So some serious management needs to be considered in terms of mercury impacts in the long term on Buru Island. But we not only have small-scale mining, as I mentioned before, there's also large-scale mining, particularly small islands, because of their volcanic formation, also lend themselves to mining operations. And Halmahera is a very good example of that. In Indonesia at the moment, there's many nickel mine sites, and there is that industrial park as well at Weda Bay, where the nickel ore is processed. There's also risk in the future of deep sea mining. Also, the bedrock around island communities can also have very enriched mineral resources, and it's probably only a matter of time before those are being exploited and are financially viable to be exploited. But when we think about mining activities, they generate an enormous amount of waste. Over 99% of mine ore in terms of gold mining is waste, and it's a little bit less than other minerals and metals that are mined. So can be between 90 to 99%. So that means tens to hundreds of thousands of tonnes per day are produced of waste every day for the lifetime of a mining operation. And when you're processing these ores, they often require very acidic conditions and use potentially harmful chemicals, which are then enriched, which are then left behind after processing. So ores are often treated prior to disposal, but they're not always rendered totally inert in the process. And a lot of the challenges come just in terms of the turbidity, the suspended particulates in the water that influence how clear the water is, and the impacts on local fisheries and fisheries resources of those local communities. So when we're thinking about mining and mining operations, there are several options for disposal of waste. There's containment, which is dams on or near mine sites, and there's long-term management in Australia, and I also think at some sites in Indonesia now, you have management up to 30 years post-closure of mine operations. So there is a decommissioning of those mine sites and a rehabilitation of the mining operations. But that's not always the case. There's also various other disposal options that you've looked at there, but that you can see there. But one of the important things is once mine waste is discharged into the river or into oceans, or deep sea tailings disposal is an example, there's no way to manage it in the future. So you actually relinquish your management control of that system. But that being said, when we're looking at containment on terrestrial land and tailings dams, there is some important engineering that needs to occur associated with our very wet conditions in the tropics and our very high rainfall. We have to be able to manage that tailings containment in the context of a very, very wet environment. So there's many challenges associated with that. And you can just see here that these are some images that from Halmahera itself, and there is some pretty clear mining operations there, and also impacts on water clarity around local communities of the Seagrass River in Halmahera. So I want to move on a little bit from mining operations and just consider nutrients. So nutrients comes not only from farming activities and also more larger scale farming activities, but also from human generated waste. And importantly, in coral reef environments, they're what we call oligotrophic. And that means that they are very, very low in nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. So coral reefs have learned to adapt, and they've grown up depending on this very low nutrient concentration and also very clear waters. You don't have massive algal blooms. Well, what happens when you add nutrients, maybe from poorly treated sewage management, could also be fertilizer and so on from agriculture. But we shift the dynamics of those ecosystems, and we force the shift in ecology from coral reef systems to algal-dominated systems. And those algal-dominated systems do not support life like coral reef ecosystems. So then you're impacting protein resources for communities. So this is truly happening in Indonesia, and I think personally it's one of the biggest concerns that I've seen on a local level in Indonesian environments, marine environments around small communities. And here are some examples from the K Islands from a few years ago. You can see on the left-hand side that coral reef is smothered by algae-dominated system. The coral reef has actually died. Those corals take years and years to come back, and will only come back if there's suitable substrate for coral larvae to settle. And once you've destroyed that system, it is very hard to bring it back. You can also have that real fine single-celled algae in water systems, and you can see that in the second picture there. And that influences turbidity as well and water clarity. And corals actually have an algae that live inside them. They're called Symbiodinium, previously known as zooxanthellae. And those corals, those algae that live inside the corals live in a symbiotic relationship with the corals, providing nutrients for the coral. But when conditions get untenable, particularly during warmer episodes, those algae will leave the coral host, and that's why we get coral bleaching events. They also need light penetration, and when you have really turbid water, those symbiotic algae that live in the corals don't get enough sunlight to function properly, and highly turbid waters really impacts coral reefs as well. So nutrient resources or nutrient waste disposal is an important management component of looking at small island communities as well. And you may think, oh, seagrasses, they would thrive in nutrient-rich environments because they're plants, and we all know if we feed our plants good nutrients, that's going to help them grow, and they'll grow really well. But what happens in seagrass communities is that you get what we call an epiphytic algal growth, and it's this growth that grows over the top of the leaf or on the top of the leaf of the seagrass, and that actually blocks the sunlight getting to the leaf of the seagrass, and it can cause mass seagrass dieback. So excessive nutrients are not healthy for seagrass communities. They also need oligotrophic environments. So we must be very careful about contributions of nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment. And if you look deeper into that, plants take up nitrogen and phosphorus in a ratio of 16 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus. We call this the Redfield ratio. So phosphorus is usually required in much lower concentrations. So there are guideline values based on what water concentrations should reflect in terms of nitrogen concentrations and phosphorus concentrations. And what might look healthy for nitrogen would be a highly excessive concentration for phosphorus. So we really need to be careful about bringing science into the play and understanding what concentration is something to be concerned about and what concentration is acceptable. And in Australia, we have the water quality guidelines, and they're set for different ecosystems of the world and of Australia. And this can be from freshwater systems to marine systems, and coral reefs have more specific guidelines as well. Overlaying the top of that, in Australia in particular, but it is an Indo-Pacific issue around our coral reef environments, is that we get crown-of-thorns outbreaks. And these photos are actually taken from Morella on Ambon, around the Ambon Island. And I've been snorkeling there for a few years now, and having noticed more and more dominance of these crown-of-thorns starfish or sea stars. And these sea stars spawn enormous numbers of gametes. The juveniles live tucked around the three-dimensional structure of coral reefs. The larvae live there, and they feed on algae. So just as I've been talking about that nutrient loading, adding algal to the system, adding nutrients to the system, the algae productivity increases, which then leads to a very much higher larval survival rate of these crown-of-thorns starfish. This happens in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef. We have outbreaks, particularly on our inshore reefs, but also the same situation arises in the Indo-Pacific region. So excess nutrients gets deposited. We have our algae production enhanced. That it provides enough food, more food for the larvae. The larvae mature, and once they get to the stage where they're not dependent on that algae anymore, they actually are consumers of coral. They spill their guts out of the center of their radial mass, and they digest corals and crawl over the coral reefs and consume coral reefs and literally kill the coral in the process of that consumption. So it is a factor that needs to be considered and managed in the context of coral reefs. So I just want to flick to, I'm just conscious a little bit of time, and I've got just some images to show, but I really want to highlight, I didn't get a chance to put them in the presentation. I actually thought it was at 1 p.m. my time, so I was a little mixed up. But I want to talk a little bit to solid waste management on small island communities. And we've taken a few field trips to the waste management facilities, both on Ambon and in Sarong. We go there with students. But importantly, on small islands where you do have limited terrestrial resources, disposing of solid waste that communities produce is also another important challenge to be managed. There's a lot of plastic waste in Indonesia, and it's only getting more and more. I have a PhD student who's here from Indonesia. She's on an Australia Award scholarship. Her name is Chamsia Ahmed, and she's based at Heran University in Ternate. And she has been looking at macro and microplastics in and around Ternate and Tidore region. She's found microplastic in fish guts, in mollusks, in fish tissues from fish markets in those regions. And she's been working on a very big community survey, which will inform future education management of plastic waste management and plastic use and consumption in the future for North Maluku province, and in particular Ternate and Tidore. So there is an awareness raising educational package that needs to be seriously considered when it comes to this plastic waste. There isn't a lot of knowledge globally in terms of the impact of consuming plastics by humans and the long-term impact of that. Of course, there's uptake, and we also pass some plastics through, but they're very prominent in our environment, microplastics as well as macroplastics. One of the major sources of microplastics is the breakdown of those macroplastics. So with UV light and sun and physical damage and so on, those larger plastics break down into much smaller plastics. One of the prominent macroplastics that was found in the surveys that Champsia did was styrofoams that were from your noodle cups. A lot of them were from the noodle cup, and also the tiny little single serve packaging was very dominant. So could be single serve coffee, single serve shampoo, single pieces in the noodles that you buy, like your flavors and so on. Very dominating over there, as well as clothing. In fact, the time that we sampled over 2 different periods, there was a lot of synthetic clothing, which was smothering coral reef areas as well, and just shallow water environments. So there's some really important management that needs to be considered and acted upon in terms of solid plastic waste. So I'm just conscious of time, and I was thinking we would have some time for questions. So I might hand back to our chair and open the floor for questions and queries.
Okay, thank you. Mandy, before Q&A session, I will read the summary in bahasa. Oke.
Thank you.
Saya sebelum sesi tanya jawab, saya akan membaca ringkasan dari kuliah tadi dalam bahasa Indonesia. Pengelolaan sumber daya kelautan di pulau kecil, karakteristik pulau kecil adalah sumber daya yang terbatas dan bergantung pada laut sebagai sumber bahan pangan, sehingga membuat terbatasnya akses pendidikan. Dalam penelitiannya terdapat beberapa pemicu stres ekosistem. Antara lain adalah polusi, pembuangan sampah yang tidak terkendali, dan juga sampah dari plastik. Pada ekosistem tropik, berbeda dari ekosistem di negara beriklim 4 musim. Dalam ekosistem tropik, curah hujan yang tinggi, kelembapan yang tinggi mengakibatkan terciptanya keistimewaan. Indonesia yang merupakan negara kepulauan membuatnya memiliki flora dan fauna yang unik serta endemik. Dalam pertemuan internasional terkait Coral Triangle Initiative yang berbicara tentang perlindungan terumbu karang, ikan, keamanan sumber bahan pangan, di mana Indonesia juga ikut serta menjadi salah satu anggota, sudah dibicarakan tentang perlindungan terkait dengan terumbu karang, ikan, serta keamanan bahan pangan di laut. Biodiversitas yang unik membuat terciptanya aneka ragam ikan dan bahan pangan di negara kepulauan. Bagaimana kehidupan masyarakat di pulau kecil yang bergeografis jauh dari pusat pemerintahan sehingga membuat akses pendidikan menjadi tidak mudah. Dalam penelitiannya di Damlea dan juga di Ambon, diketemukan bahwa dalam kedua lokasi ini kaya akan ikan grunter, ikan yang menjadi target pemancingan komersil karena rasanya enak, tetapi justru masih diburu tanpa pengawasan yang memadai. Juga dalam penelitiannya masih terdapat bahan pangan laut yang mengandung merkuri yang tinggi dan tentu saja berisiko ketika dikonsumsi oleh manusia. Di sisi lain, kesejahteraan masyarakat pesisir belum baik. Selain aktivitas pertambangan dan sampah yang tidak terkendali sehingga membuat polusi pada Laut Ambon dan juga Namlea yang makin tinggi, di Namlea sisa batuan halus dan air hasil pemrosesan biji emas menjadi penyumbang tertinggi polusi laut. Seharusnya kita waspada pada menurunnya kualitas gizi bahan pangan laut yang terkontaminasi. Di Australia sudah terdapat sistem yang diciptakan untuk melindungi bahan pangan laut. Bagaimana di Indonesia? Apakah ada pertanyaan? Well, any question you can ask in Indonesia, in bahasa, I will translate it, or you can ask in English. Not only the students at auditorium, but also the students who join at Zoom meeting, you can write your question or column chat or raise your hand. Mandy, before the students asking, I want a question for you. Uh, Probably just a simple question. According to you, how to handle the pollution of Ambon Bay? What should we do as a student to protect our sea at Ambon? But based on your lecture before, you said that one Ambon Bay is the pollution at Ambon Bay is a high risk. How should we do as a student to protect our sea?
Ambon Bay captures a lot of pollution, and it doesn't, when it's put into the water, when people discard of it not into the proper waste disposal bins, it ends up in the water system, and you can sort of see up in that top end of Ambon Bay a lot. So always with environmental problems, it requires a multi-pronged approach. So of course, education and educating communities about not discarding waste is an important component. Having proper waste collection facilities, so having your local bupati have good waste collection facilities is very important. Recycling where possible. I know that also comes with challenges, as with Australia. And also think before you take, so you can actually minimize the consumption of the plastic. So yeah, I have a very personal experience when many years ago in 1993, I was in Germany, and you had to pay for your plastic bag if you wanted a plastic bag, and most people didn't use plastic bags. And everyone thought that was a good idea because plastic bags generated so much waste. And I came back to Australia and we just used plastic bags all the time. Maybe all the shopping came in plastic bags and you were given plastic bags. Everyone knew, there was a problem with the plastic bags. And it wasn't until I think it was maybe 2021, but only about 5 years ago, maybe a little more, that the federal government in Australia put a ban on single-use plastic bags. So we have this, we're not very good at doing what we should do unless there's a rule around what we do. Even though in our minds we know it's not good to take a plastic bag, we do it because we're conditioned to do it and we'll take it, and we don't have our reusable bag with us all the time because we're not conditioned to do this. So really it comes to having good waste collection resources so people know how to dispose of their waste properly, and having the council and your bupati managing the waste from that end. It's about source reduction, and it's also about community education. And there's some good psychological studies that are about these early adopters, and often young people. A lot of you people sitting here in the audience as students, you will be actually the early adopters, and you'll be educating your parents in terms of plastic management and plastic health. So it's generational change that takes time too. Yeah, Ambon Bay, we do cleanups too. So it almost sometimes looks defeating, but all those mangroves around University of Padimura, I'm sure we've joined some of you students when I've had my students over there. But you do one big collection day, and 3 weeks later it's all back again. So there's a huge amount of plastic already in the system that actually needs to be managed and cleaned up. There's some great Indonesian initiatives that are happening in other parts of Indonesia that are helping to manage that as well.
Thank you. We have a question from you can read it. Good morning, Prof. Amanda. Okay, from Cecily Latoperisa.
I'll just give it a read.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Mm, she would like to thank you for this opportunity to wait a moment.
Oh, it's a very good point.
Yes.
So indeed, our marine science systems in Australia, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, has federal government funding because it's recognised as a natural wonder of the world due to its extensiveness. But that is not the case for all our marine ecosystems in Australia and our estuarine ecosystems. In fact, the region I live in has a river system called the Richmond River, and perhaps I'll do a presentation to you about my river system sometime in the future. But it's one of the most degraded river systems in New South Wales. I live in a regional environment. It doesn't have a high population. There's not a big rate base, and the funding is very limited to help improve the health of that river. So I totally appreciate that there's limited budgets and human resources. In fact, you do have enormous human resources because you've got a high population. So you can draw upon those human resources as well. But it's about finding the fit that works for the community. And community can empower themselves as well. The more you rely on external resources and initiatives, the less control you have of a system as well. So sometimes community energy and community power is what develops change and makes change as well. So there's an advantage with small island communities because they're usually very tight-knit communities. They've got an authoritative leader that everybody respects. So if that leader had the initiative to help manage situations of waste management and waste disposal, I'm sure you would get a lot of buy-in from the community. There's some great community initiatives happening. So don't be disheartened because it's not money around. I think small islands are somewhat of a manageable unit to deal with compared to massive landscape that Australia deals with as well. So think about what are the opportunities based in those areas to help manage that. Will I go on? There is another message from Star Lapelolo Bintang. Your thoughts on illegal fishing, oil dumping in the sea, considering it might play a part on contaminating ecosystems as well as deep sea mines. Indeed, illegal fishing is really an issue for the sustainable management of fisheries resources, which include small island communities. You get illegal fishers coming down from China Sea and Philippines and perhaps other countries, China as well. In fact, we do get some Indonesian illegal fishers in our waters as well. So we're dealing with a problem as well. And I think it's about having really enforceable regulations and monitoring of that illegal fishing. I think your Minister Susi a few years ago was doing some pretty good initiatives about deterring illegal fishers coming into Indonesian waters. I think she blew up a few illegal fishing boats. Probably, I think it was in Ambon Bay, if I remember correctly. But yes, there has to be major disincentives for illegal fishers. And I think it's a resource that needs protecting. Oil dumping, I'm not sure too much about what you mean by oil dumping, but people are disposing of oils, or maybe there's oil leaks. It's an interesting one, of course. Marine ecosystems are fragile to oils, and depend particularly in that tidal area where the tide comes in and goes out. The oil usually sits on the surface of the water, so in those tidal ecosystems, it's where it deposits. So again, it's about a regulatory environment that disincentivizes that, and it provides ways of disposing of that oil suitably and properly. So sometimes people will do the worst option for the environment because they can't see a better option around. So it's about directing people to those facilities that do provide oil dumping, and maybe that's from fishing boats or so on. But yeah, have to come back to port and have a cleaning system, perhaps. Okay, so I think I'll move on to the next question. Mohammed Ragabaka. In the context of policy comparison with Australia, is the failure to protect endemic species and coral reefs in Indonesia primarily due to a lack of stringent regulation or weak enforcement? Weak enforcement of law across vast and remote archipelago territories. It is a huge challenge, and it's a huge challenge for Australia as well. So you have poaching as an issue in terms of those resources. You've got some quite good monitoring of that poaching, and there is enforcement associated with that poaching, which is good. It could probably be improved. And like I sort of said before, I think that multi-pronged approach, it's like you can use law and enforcement to manage a system, but it's only as good as the regulatory environment that you can work in. Just because a law exists doesn't mean it's enforced or enforceable. So there has to be enforcement of the law for sure, and weak enforcement can be a problem, but also creating a perception that that is the wrong thing to do, and people not choosing to do that just because they want to abide by the law, but they know it's the wrong thing to do. So it's about people being law-abiding citizens in an important way. So you develop a law. Yes, you can enforce it and invest in it, but by and large, the broader population should be noting that law and not breaking that law. And then the enforcement comes through compliance. So compliance to law is a very important part of that education process that I think for communities. So I hope that helps answer that one a little bit. And just note, it's just a lot of it is my opinion, right? You will be living and breathing it every day, and you people are going to have some good ideas on how to manage your own unique circumstances too. So this is just my thoughts and might help trigger some of your thoughts in terms of your unique situations. Okay, so we'll go on to brilliant David Arrela Lesnusa. I'm sure I said that wrong, but we'll go a little bit into this. Thank you for the compliment on the lecture. Brilliant wants to ask me about the problem of microplastics that harm flora and fauna in the ocean. How can we manage this problem? If I had the solutions to that, I might be a millionaire, but no. So there's a very large proportion of microplastics that are produced from macroplastics as a part of that breakdown process, and the UV weathering and the physical weathering of those plastics being in water. Those plastics are all human generated. They're all generated by human beings. The input into the environment is 100% human being problem. No other creature on Earth puts plastic into the oceans and into our environment. So we are totally responsible for that as human beings. So source management is the best way to manage future introductions of plastics into the ocean. So there are some really good videos about Indonesian capture of plastic waste in river systems and managing cleanup programs. And I think you could probably look to some major initiatives in the past in other countries, and it might not just be plastic, but at some stage they were contaminated sites and they've been managed. I know, yes, it does cost a lot of money. Plastic is somewhat a little bit more easy to deal with because it is solid waste. It's not a chemical waste that needs to be managed and cleaned, and water quality needs to be improved. So getting rid of the problem will not happen by looking at it and complaining about it. Getting rid of the problem will be resolved by acting, minimizing the source, reducing the future production of plastic waste, but also having large cleanup operations of the existing plastic that's out there. And it's really hard. There's a lot of physicality impacts associated to plastics and marine biota, strangling and those physical problems. But really, we don't have a lot of good understanding about the impacts of plastics on marine biota. We've done an enormous amount of measuring, and what I must say is our science and our measuring tools use very many different sampling techniques, which are not very comparable to each other. So it's very hard to sort of assess whether someone's study from one area, the units may be different or the sampling design may be different. So it's not comparable to the studies in another area. So I think as scientists, we've got a lot to do in terms of standardizing the rigor associated with that monitoring. But very importantly, monitoring doesn't manage it. Monitoring is important for managers to then take the steps to manage the problem. We can measure all we want, all the plastics in the world that we want, but if we're not removing them and setting management actions in place, they're still going to keep entering the environment, and our monitoring would be just showing that they're increasing. So mitigating is really important. Mitigating the problem is where your thoughts should be focused rather than just monitoring. I think I'll hand back to the chair. I don't think there's any more questions in the chat.
Mandy, well, as our deal, the class will run maximum in 50 minutes, as I promised to you. Uh, I think this is the end of our class, Mandy.
Oh,
Thank you very, very much to join with us at Faculty of Law, Patimura University. And I hope we will see you next week. You will join with us next time or maybe next semester. Thank you very much. And for the students who join with us at auditorium at Zoom meeting to attend the lecture, thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for the question, for the reaction, for especially for our special loving guest lecturer, Prof. Amanda Brushett from Southern Cross University, Lismore, Australia.
thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. I love doing these presentations. I'll be in Indonesia later this year, so I look forward to meeting with you, hopefully. And good luck with your studies. Yeah, you're the new generation that are going to make the difference, right? So you work hard and study hard, and look forward to maybe seeing you sometime. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.